Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast is your one-stop shop for fantasy football news and advice. Can't decide on who to draft on the first round? Going gaga on how to line up your team. Got you covered. Traditional leagues, dynasty league, PPR league, IDP league, even daily fantasy football league. Join us as we break down all the questions of fantasy football. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast.
Welcome to the Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast, where we discuss everything there is to know about fantasy football. I'm your host, Jeremiah, and we are back again with another one for you guys. It is Super Bowl week officially. Officially kicked off last night, and one of the top storylines that is very, very, very fantasy relevant is the contract of Devonta Freeman. And the reason why I think this is so relevant to fantasy is because, when you're in a contract year, players tend to perform at a higher level. Sometimes that is. Well, Devonta Freeman's agent really kind of picked a weird time to talk about the client's contract situation. And Dan Quinn said Devonta Freeman's contract is a great topic for next week. But Devonta Freeman's agent said that Freeman deserves top 3 running back money. And I was thinking to myself when I was reading this interview on NFL.com with Mike Silver and Devonta Freeman's agent, it is kind of a weird time to talk about a player's contract, especially when you're at a Super Bowl. And Devonta Freeman did not want to comment on the matter during opening night. But when I think of Devonta Freeman, he was a top 10 fantasy running back this year. And he was a guy that would get you at least 100 yards total. Like not every game, but he would be that type of player to give you 100 yards total yards from scrimmage. And he did have, he had the season with over 1,500 yards of scrimmage and 13 touchdowns. And that is a lot. That is a lot, and Devonta Freeman is one of the reasons why the Falcons are in the Super Bowl. But I wanted to ask the question to you guys: is Devonta Freeman is he a top 3 running back? Is he a top fantasy running back? Is he a guy that you can slide into your RB1 position? I don't think so. And don't get me wrong, Devonta Freeman was a phenomenal player this year. I just think that's a little bit of an overvalue of a running back who is in a timeshare with Tevin Coleman, who is also a great running back. Tevin Coleman was a great running back to use in fantasy this year. I just think the fact that Devonta Freeman was in the timeshare, it really did hinder his value. But I think if Devonta Freeman was in a workhorse situation, then I think it would have been different. But I think the fact of the matter is, I think it kept both running backs very healthy throughout this year. And they are a huge reason why. They're a huge reason why the Falcons are here where they are this week. But the fact that, Devonta Freeman being valued as a top 3 running back, I think that is a little bit of a reach. I think Devonta Freeman is someone that you can get in the second or third round. It kind of depends where they want to do with Tevin Coleman. But I think the Falcons coaching staff, they found a formula that works with both running backs. I do think that the fact that they're in a timeshare really helped each other out. There were times when Tevin Coleman had more pass receiving yards than rushing yards, and then there were times when Devonta Freeman had more rushing yards than receiving yards. So they kind of went hand in hand. There were times when they're probably the only duo in the NFL that you can start at the same time because they're used so heavily. And the offense that they're in really has them play successful as well. But, I wanted to go over Devonta Freeman's stats here. He did have over 500 scrimmage yards, and he had, a total of 13 touchdowns. And as for Tevin Coleman, he had, I think he had close to 1,000 yards of total scrimmage yards. And, he had a total of 11 touchdowns. So, between the both of these guys, they had over 2,500 yards total. And when you had the touchdowns play into it, that's like almost 20. That's like up to 20 touchdowns total. So the fact is, I don't know if Devonta Freeman will get that money because running backs aren't as valuable to teams as they used to be back in the day. But when I think of the top 3 running backs, fantasy, I think of Le'Veon Bell, I think of David Johnson, and I think of Ezekiel Elliott. You can even put LaShawn McCoy in the mix too. But when I compare Devonta Freeman to those 3 or 4 guys, I would stay away from Devonta Freeman. And if I had to pick between Le'Veon Bell, David Johnson, Ezekiel, and LaShawn McCoy, I wouldn't even think about Devonta Freeman. And that's nothing against him. I think Devonta Freeman is a phenomenal player. It's just that he's in a timeshare. I think he's good because of the offense is good. And, the offense that those other players are in, they have 20 to 30 touches a game. I just think that Devonta Freeman would be a little overvalued if he was viewed as a top 3 running back. So, his agent said Devonta Freeman was a top 3 running back in this league, and he didn't even show why since he was in the timeshare this year. But even if Devonta Freeman doesn't get this contract as a top running back, I wouldn't be surprised. And if Devonta Freeman would have to go elsewhere other than Atlanta, it's not going to happen this year because he still has years on his contract, but he's eligible to renegotiate a new deal. And I think he's outplayed his current deal. I think he's making like $800,000 including bonuses. I think he's really outplayed that. I just don't think he's going to get top running back money. I don't think he's going to make more than Adrian Peterson, LaShawn McCoy does. I just don't think he's going to get the elite running back money. And, running backs, being an elite running back is kind of different than being an elite quarterback, so to speak. It is a different position. And back in the day when running backs run the show, back in the 80s, the 90s, you had to have a running back to win a football game. It was built differently. Now you need a quarterback. A lot of teams don't even value running backs anymore. You see the Green Bay Packers, how they value running backs. You see the Seahawks, they want to be a running football team, but they have instability at the running back position. You've seen what these type of teams have done to running back position, how they value them. And I do think the Falcons do value that position because, they do have 2 guys that are valuable and can start for any team in the league. But I just don't think they want to overpay for someone. But as far as Devonta Freeman's fantasy value for 2017, I think he's a perfect guy to target and late in the second round, and the third round as well. As far as Tevin Coleman, I think he's someone that can be viewed, in the fourth round, in the fifth round. The reason why I say that is because Devonta Freeman does happen to get a little more carries in the ground game, but Coleman is heavily involved in the passing game, and you've seen what he can do. So I do think both of these guys are valuable wherever you get them next year, and I think they're in for another great year in the Falcons offense. And I know Kyle Shanahan's not going to he's not going to be there because he is going to be the 49ers' next head coach as he's presumed to be. But I do think these guys will have a good year next year, no matter what happens this Sunday into Super Bowl. But I'm going to take my first break, and I'm actually going to still talk about the Atlanta Falcons. I actually want to talk about the year Matt Ryan has had and what has changed. What has changed in his career? I will discuss that when I get back to the Going to Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the Going to Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast, and I discussed Devonta Freeman's fantasy value heading into 2017 and how his contract negotiations will play that out. I want to talk about his quarterback, Matt Ryan, who is probably going to be MVP, and he's on his way to playing in his first ever Super Bowl, and it is the Falcons' ever second Super Bowl appearance in franchise history. But we see Matt Ryan heading to the year wasn't even looked at as a top fantasy quarterback. I don't think he was even drafted in some leagues. I think there was a lot of quarterbacks that were drafted ahead of him. Like, for example, quarterbacks that were drafted ahead of Matt Ryan this year was Andy Dalton, Blake Bortles, and in some cases, Alex Smith. The fact that Alex Smith was picked over Matt Ryan in fantasy is ridiculous when you look at it now. Matt Ryan wasn't even on the fantasy radars in some drafts. He started out the year very strong. In week 1, he passed for 334 yards and 2 touchdowns against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. They lost that game, but he had a very good game in that one. And week 2 against the Oakland Raiders, he threw for 396 yards and 3 touchdowns. Did throw a pick, but still a strong fantasy performance. So he became on the radar now, heading into a week 3 matchup in New Orleans against the Saints. And he had a great fantasy performance in that one as well. He went for 240 yards passing and 2 touchdowns. So right now he's probably on a lot of rosters, and he has probably started the next week. So week 4 comes along. And man, Matt Ryan puts on a show at the Georgia Dome against the Carolina Panthers. He throws for 503 yards, 4 touchdowns. And don't forget, this was the game that Julio Jones had 300 yards in, which I think is the best fantasy performance of the entire year. So by now, he's probably started in a lot of leagues. And then you if you just look at his stats from every game this year, he was the most consistent, the most dangerous quarterback in fantasy football. And he finished the year with 38 touchdowns and 7 interceptions. So by the time that Carolina game came around, he was facing the Broncos the week after. Had a fairly decent game, 267 yards, and a touchdown. And then against the Seahawks, a very tough defense, just as tough as the Broncos defense, threw for 335 yards and 3 touchdowns. And I think that I just want to talk about why. I just want to talk about the evolution of his career. Why did he become a different player all of a sudden? Why did he play to a second level? And Matt Ryan's been in the league for 9 seasons now. And remember, he was known as a playoff choke artist before this year. And if you guys don't remember, the Falcons started out, I believe, 5-0, 6-0 in 2015. And then they went 8-8 and missed the playoffs. This year, the Falcons' offense was just on a whole different level. And they scored the 8th most points in NFL history. The evolution of Matt Ryan's career has been amazing. It took him a long time to get that first playoff win. And he got that first playoff win, I believe, in 2011, I believe. Yeah, he got that first playoff win in the 2011 season, but, it took place in 2012 when he won the divisional game against the Seahawks and took him to the NFC Championship and lost that game to the 49ers, who went on to lose to the Ravens in the Super Bowl. Then the Falcons haven't been back to the playoffs the next 4 years. They just haven't been to the playoffs. And they were just looked at, he was looked at as an average quarterback in this league. He just never went up to that top tier level quarterbacks. I think Matt Ryan has finally entered that top tier quarterbacks. And I do think if Matt Ryan wins the MVP with the Super Bowl, I do think he will enter elite status, and we will debate it if that does happen. But as of now, I do think he is someone that is going to have the same success next year. And I know Kyle Shanahan, who has been considered responsible for the turnaround of Matt Ryan's career, he's not going to be there next year. He's going to be the coach of the 49ers. And I do think that Matt Ryan has finally learned so much. I think his skills have finally matured. He has emerged as a top quarterback now. I do think what he's learned from Kyle Shanahan and being in this offense, I do think he's something that he can hold on to, and he can be a fantasy quarterback. I'm not going to say he's going to throw for 40 touchdowns again. I'm just saying I do think he can be consistent. And this year has shown me that Matt Ryan has become a whole different quarterback, and he's finally becoming the guy that we all thought he would be. And he's going to be an elite quarterback if he wins the Super Bowl. I do think he will enter that status if he wins. When you look at Matt Ryan's career in fantasy football, this is no doubt the best year he's ever had. This is the best year. This is the most touchdowns he's ever had since the last time the Falcons were in the playoffs in 2012. He threw for 32 touchdowns on 14 interceptions that year. And every year after that, he just was struggling with interceptions. In 2013, Matt Ryan threw for 17 touchdowns. 14 he threw for 14. 15 he threw for 16. This year he threw only 7. So I do think that Matt Ryan's game has evolved in a different way, and I think we're finally seeing it. I think we're kind of like seeing the way that Peyton Manning's career has evolved. Remember, it took Peyton Manning forever to win a playoff game. It took him forever to win the Super Bowl. I kind of think Matt Ryan's on the same track. But I do think he has to win this game. He has to win the Super Bowl to become an elite quarterback, or else, he's still going to have the same old question. He's going to be a choke artist. I do think that's going to come up. But heading into next year, I do think Matt Ryan is someone that's going to be drafted in all leagues. I think he's going to be one of the top 3, top 4 quarterbacks taken. He might be the first one taken. Because, I do think he still has Julio Jones. He's going to have those 2 running backs. So I think he's going to be probably maybe the first quarterback taken, but he's definitely going to be in the top 3 or 4 taken in the draft. And if he's going to have the same success, I think he can. I just don't think he would. I don't think he's going to have an MVP year again, because it's so hard to have an MVP year the year after you had it. Because just look at Cam Newton this year. He was the MVP in 2015. And when you look at his career, he was not the same player at all. That team was not the same. So if you do draft Matt Ryan next year, I would kind of not have high expectations, but you should feel comfortable with him. I don't think Matt Ryan's going to be Cam Newton in 2017, but I do think he would be very valuable, and I do think if you draft him in the 2nd or 3rd round, I do think you should feel comfortable with him. Well, I'm going to take my last break, and I want to discuss potential breakout stars for 2017. When I get back to the Going to Meet Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast.
Are you looking for the very best NFL and college football podcast? Then check out the GSMC Football Podcast. Get the latest football news both on and off the field. From the NFL Draft to trades to the rumor mill to the NFL Combines. They got you covered. That's GSMCpodcast.com/football-podcast. Get updates on college rivalries, game day insights, and much, much more. It's football talk the way you want it. This show eats, sleeps, and breathes football. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
And the commercial that you just heard was for the Going to Meet Concepts Football Podcast, which I host Monday through Friday. And make sure to tune in every day this week as I discuss pretty much anything there is to know in the Super Bowl and any news that occurs in the world of football. That's not just the NFL. I also talk about college football as well. Well, as regarding the fantasy football show, I wanted to discuss, I think, the top breakout players for 2017. I think the top breakout player in my mind is going to be Kenneth Dixon. I do think he will become the starter. And we've seen what type of year Terrence West has had. He was just very inconsistent. And, the offensive line really hurt, Dixon in college. But, you can see the potential that Dixon has had. We've seen Dixon in limited action. It did take him a while to get into the field. He was he was rehabbing a knee injury. But when he got on the field, he made the most of it. He averaged 4.3 yards a carry, but when he was on the field, he wasn't given a whole lot of opportunities. I think the most carries he had in the game was 13, and I do think that John Harbaugh and the coaching staff, they do see a lot of potential in Dixon. You can't have Terrence West as your running back again. You can't. But I think heading to next year, the Ravens do want a game-changing running back, and I do think Dixon can be that guy. If he happens to become the starter, I think he's going to be a for sure RB1 because He's someone that can take a lot of carries. He can get yards after contact, and that's something that I look at as well. And he can be a passing down back as well. And if running backs can be involved in the passing game while being involved as a rusher, that bodes well for me. That is huge. That is huge value right there. And I do think he can be the game-changing running back that the Ravens are hoping for in 2017. And another running back on my radar as a breakout candidate is Paul Perkins. But he has a tougher road than Kenneth Dixon has because, they still got Jane Farine in the mix. And Rashad Jennings is probably going to be let go. But I think the fact that Shane Vereen is still in the mix is going to kind of hurt his value a little bit. Shane Vereen was slated to be a passing down back, but he could take some carries away from Paul Perkins. And I do think if Paul Perkins happens to emerge as the starter for the Giants, I think it's going to be huge because we've seen what he has done. I've seen what Paul Perkins has done. And when he has at least 15 carries, the Giants, the Giants are very successful. And his best game of the year came in the final game of the season against the Washington Redskins when he had 21 yards, 102 yards. He had 21 carries. He averaged 4.9 yards. And I do think, a running back is the missing piece for this offense. They do need some offensive line help as well, but I do think the fact that they can have a running back to help Eli Manning in that passing attack, I think it will bode well. And speaking of the Giants, I think Eli Manning is a breakout candidate. The reason why I say that, I think he can beat 2017's Matt Ryan. I really do think so. I think if the Giants can get a reliable running game, if they can work on their offensive line and protect Eli Manning, I think Eli Manning can be Matt Ryan in 2017. And I know he's going to be, I know he's 36. He's getting older. But I still think he still has some good football left in him. And from 2014 to 2015, he has thrown for at least 30 touchdowns. And when you have receivers like Odell Beckham, who's looked at as a top receiver in this league, despite what you think of his antics, and when you got Sterling Shepard, who I think is going to have a great year, and I think if Victor Cruz if he comes back a little healthier next year, I think it's going to bode well huge for Eli Manning. So I think if they get a running game and if they get at least some offensive line help, I think Eli Manning can be Matt Ryan of 2017. And another quarterback on my radar, I don't know if he can call him a breakout candidate because, he did show some flashes last year, but I want to go with Marcus Mariota. I think he will be a top quarterback by the end of 2017. I do think so. Because from weeks 5 to 12, man, Marcus Mariota was putting on a show. He had the highest ceiling as anyone, and I still think he has the highest ceiling. I do think, if the Tennessee Titans add some receivers, I think Marcus Mariota is going to be a very good, fantasy quarterback. I don't think he's going to be like Blake Bortles and just fall off. I think he's going to be one of the top quarterbacks by the end of 2017. I do think he's someone that you can get good value for in the middle rounds at the quarterback position. He was putting quarterback one numbers. From 5 to 17, he was throwing at least 3 touchdowns in those games. And I'm really glad that Marcus Mariota is playing the way that the Titans thought he would play. But I do think if the Titans do add some receivers, because they got 2 good running backs there, DeMarco Murray and Derrick Henry. If they add some receivers, I do think Marcus Mariota will be in for a huge year, and so will the Titans. I do think they are a breakout team. I do think they are a wild card contender heading to 2017. And my final breakout player for 2017, I'm going to go with J.J. Nelson. He's going to enter his 3rd year with the Cardinals, and I do think he will get a bigger role. He was slated to have a bigger role at the end of the year. He had really 2 games to end 2017 on. In Week 16 against the Seahawks, he had 132 yards and a touchdown. He only had 3 receptions, and he was targeted 7 times in that game, so he could have had a lot more. And in the final week against the Rams, he had 75 yards on 4 receptions, and he had 12 targets. So he could have had even more receptions, more yards. So I do think that they like J.J. Nelson, and they see the potential that he has. I do think he can be the top target, maybe the 2nd target, depending on if Larry Fitzgerald happens to retire or not. And with Michael Floyd gone, I do think J.J. Nelson is going to be a breakout player. I do think he has a chance to finish out as a top 15 receiver in fantasy, and I think he's going to be very valuable in the middle rounds. So those are my top breakout players. I have Kenneth Dixon, Paul Perkins, Marcus Mariota, Eli Manning, and J.J. Nelson as my top fantasy breakout players for 2017. And as far as where you should draft those guys, well, I probably won't discuss my top 100 or top 200 probably until like later in the spring. But, we're always going to be here during the offseason because there is no offseason at the Going to Meet Concepts Podcast Network. But that concludes the show for today. And make sure to be back on Friday as we will pretty much talk all things Super Bowl and the fantasy show. Anthony will be here. And, you can catch the show on a variety of platforms: iTunes, Google Play, YouTube, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and on GSMCpodcast.com. That is the website. You can also follow the show on social media, Twitter and Instagram. The handles are at GSMC_FFootball. And on Facebook, that is at the Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast. And I'd like to thank you guys for tuning in to the show. Be back Friday. My name is Jeremiah, and you guys have a good day and have a pleasant